Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, where we talk about all things that are imaginary. I am that sad stuffed spider toy that's left in the thrift store because no kid wants to buy it.
Aww.
My name is Tony.
Hi, Tony. My name is Kendra, and I am the spider costume that you put on your cat to terrify your neighbors.
Fucking spider cat costumes.
And that's my story.
So, before we start today, I will say, Kendra sent me a gif of a dog in a spider like a tiny little dog in a spider costume right before we started recording, and that shit is weird.
I'm looking at it right now. It just makes my mood so much... I mean, there's a hurricane hitting the U.S., there's the president being unpresidential, there's all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah.
But if you look at this gif of a dog or a cat in a spider costume, it goes a long way towards making you have, maybe not faith in humanity, but, I don't know,
faith in
joy.
Caninity?
Faith in arachnids, faith in dogs,
Arachnidity.
Faith in cats.
So, as you can probably tell by our introduction today, we are talking about spiders in science fiction and fantasy and all things that are imaginary. I wish spiders were imaginary. No, that's not true. I will say, before we begin, that Kendra and I are both arachnophobes. So,
Totally.
Doing this podcast is probably going to be our greatest challenge so far, greater than considering the end of civilization as we know it in the dystopia podcast.
That's already happened, so basically
right.
What's left is the spider.
Right. So we will be referring regularly to our show notes entitled, Why Does It Have to Be Spiders? And I think it's good if we just start off and talk about what kind of spiders we're talking about. Where are our creepy crawlies crawling out of?
Well, and also the relationship specifically between spiders and sci-fi. Like, is it always sci-fi if there are creepy, weird-ass giant spiders? Or can that be non-sci-fi with, arachnid hauntings? Or, like, does having the spiders in it as a character, as an important feature, necessarily make something that otherwise doesn't follow the trappings of sci-fi become sci-fi? I'm thinking of, like, Charlotte's Web and so on and so forth. But, I mean, because it's easy to look at Lord of the Rings and be like, oh, yes, because we have wizards and because we have elves, it's all right if we have giant talking spiders.
Right.
That's, like, part of the sci-fi trope. But, I mean, Charlotte's Web, you also have talking spiders, but is it sci-fi? That's what I want to know. So that's my big pressing question for today. Also, why?
Well, let's get into it with some examples and see what we think.
Okay, so I named two of mine. What are some of your go-to spiders of sci-fi and beyond?
Well, there's always Lord of the Rings, like you said. There's always Harry Potter. Big, large spiders in fantasy, I think, is something that one encounters quite often. I also listed Zelda and the recurring spider baddies from that. Video games in general, things that are set in vaguely fantastical universes, no matter what they are, tend to have spiders as bad guys. You defeat a lot of spiders. You kill spiders with swords. That's just a thing that happens in a lot of video games.
And it's because they're so gooey inside. It makes for a great graphic.
Ew.
Squasher stab a giant spider and it,
Exactly.
I just did that, by the way.
That's true. That's a thing that happened.
Yeah.
Well, book-wise, we listed a couple of different books. We just talked a couple weeks ago about Spaceman of Bohemia.
Oh, so good.
Which has a not really spider-ish character, Hanush. Who may be a figment of the main character's imagination. Please listen to that podcast if you haven't yet, because you will learn more about maybe spiders. I also flagged Perdido Street Station by China Miéville.
Which you told me not to read China Miéville, so I have yet to read China Miéville.
I don't know. I'm on the fence. But I did read Perdido Street Station all the way through, and the character of the Weaver, who is a trans-dimensional spider who speaks in, not riddles, it's kind of like it's trying to be poetry or something, but it makes too much sense for it to be the kind of like free associative thing I think it's supposed to be.
Wait, are you saying that poetry is supposed to not make sense?
No, it's the way that this character speaks, the other characters kind of refer to it as like being so mind-bendingly weird that they can't ever figure it out. And as I was reading it, I was like, come the fuck on, characters. Like, this shit is not hard to figure out. Yeah, it's not that weird.
But I mean, isn't that a sci-fi trope too, or a fantasy trope, perhaps? Yeah. Where there's some sort of riddle or prophecy and nobody understands it, but the reader kind of does.
Yeah, it's this weird bit. It's like a spin-off of dramatic irony or something. But you're also supposed to be the characters in that moment who don't understand it, but because you understand it as a reader, you kind of like have a lesser opinion of the characters. And I don't know, I'm sure we could do a whole nother podcast on that, whatever that sensation is. But Spiders,
and so Spaceman of Bohemia by Jaroslav Kolfar. All of our love to that. We did talk about the story at length and various other plot points with our good friend Park. We highly recommend you listen to that episode. But I think there will be room later in the conversation to talk a little bit more about Hanush, not just as another example of the form, but as perhaps a new wave, so to speak, of spider representation in literature.
Yep.
And I do want to talk about like the progression through time. I also want to talk about an author who we both love extraordinarily, and that is Adrian Tchaikovsky, author of Children of Time. And so we'll get into that book as well here quite a bit in the podcast, correct?
Yes, correct.
Where do you want to start? Because we've thrown out a lot of different sort of avenues in that we could do right now.
I want to start with your initial question. Doth science fiction or fantasy a spider make? So, I think we can look at this in two different ways. I think Charlotte's Web is an excellent example. We have the kind of fantastical children's avenue to go down there. And on the other hand, the movie Arachnophobia, which is a little old and is definitely like playing on some horror tropes, some B-movie tropes, but not to the point of like Eight-Legged Freaks or, older movies that were like giant spiders terrorizing New York or whatever.
That was cockroaches, and we talked about that as well when we talked about monsters.
Yeah. So, in both of those cases, though, let's think about Charlotte's Web first. So, when I think about Charlotte's Web, and obviously these categories are a little more muddled for children's books, but I don't think of Charlotte's Web as a book of fantasy. I think of it as fantastical, but then I think of most children's books as fantastical, even if you're thinking of something like, I don't know, Harriet the Spy. Even though there's nothing overtly unreal about that story, like it seems, just the telling of it seems sort of fantastical. Like, there's no difference between, and I mean, of course there is a difference, but Louise Fitzhugh is in the same category as like Roald Dahl and Beverly Cleary and Madeleine L'Engle and, these folks who are telling stories, and it doesn't matter if there's travel between worlds. It doesn't matter if there's just like the experience of what the second grade is like they're of a canon for me.
And I think part of that might come down to, and I'm saying this as a children's librarian who purchases vast quantities of children's picture books every, month. There is a tendency to view childhood or childish thinking as magical in the first place. So as adults, we create picture books for children, which we as readers, as adult readers, reinvest our days with magic and with the magical thinking that we project children as always having. I think that it's a little bit of a construct. I think there's a lot of times and a lot of places in the world where children don't have the luxury to think whimsically and magically. But at the same time, even under the toughest circumstances, there do seem to be like glimmers of hope in a lot of books and a lot of texts where children are able to escape dark circumstances by thinking magically. But I don't think that those two things are neatly equitable, that children always have this power to think magically, and that we should always encourage children to think magically. I think there's a little bit of a mess there in terms of what we permit ourselves to believe children should read. And then we create books to kind of further that that construct that we've embraced. So anyway, that's my little rant about children's picture books. But there are loads of children's picture books about spiders where they're clearly not trying to be fantasy or sci-fi. They're just
of course.
It'll be like bumblebees and maybe not cockroaches, because even kids don't like those all that much, but like bumblebees and ladybugs and spiders all hanging out and that sort of a thing, talking. So
dirty spider propaganda. I get what you're saying.
Well, I mean, we do start kids young, and that's another thing to kind of transition into talking about during our podcast, where at least for a while there, spider depictions in literature, children's and adults literature, it was pretty universally negative. Shelob in Lord of the Rings and all of those acromantulas in Harry Potter, they were all negative portrayals. And that's what made B-grade movies like Arachnophobia work, is because we'd kind of already bought into this mindset of spiders are inherently creepy and horrible, and if you make them large, then they're even more inherently creepy and evil. And
the reason why I wanted to bring up Arachnophobia in particular, which I have seen once and I will never see again, but it more than any other movie, I think, that stars spiders as the main bad guys, dallies with this idea that maybe there's some scientific plausibility to how the spiders in Arachnophobia got a little bit bigger. They're not giant spiders, but also very venomous. They kill this little town, essentially. And the reason why I say it dallies with the science is that, there's this stuff about interbreeding, and they invest time in sort of explaining how it happens, and that the spider came back from a researcher's trip down to the Amazon or something, some sort of faraway exotic place, exotic in quotes. But I think that in particular, the sort of like stabbing at there's a scientific explanation to this horror, pushes it more into the science fiction camp to me, more so than the spiders themselves. Like, if they were making, it could just as easily be a movie about centipedes or killer roaches or something, and, following the same, like, pseudoscience beats, it would also be science fiction. So I think my bottom line is, like, spiders don't make science fiction or fantasy, but they are often considered in the umbrella of things that you can throw into science fiction fantasy fairly easily.
Well, I was going to bring up the, okay, so who was the first Spider-Man in our childhood?
Tobey Maguire.
Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, and the gymnastics that those films go through in order to give him and all the other characters their powers. Like, I remember watching the scene where the spider escapes from its container or whatever and bites him and being like, it doesn't work that way. Like, that's not... It's not a viral vector or, whatever. And I was like 12 when that movie came out. So, don't trust my instincts then. But I do think as an adult now, looking back at the first of the reboots, that there is this weird sort of in-between situation with characters like Spider-Man, because they are science fictional sort of in and of themselves, in that most superhero movies are considered sci-fi and fantasy, at least where they are placed in the non-existent blockbusters.
Right.
And yet, like, they treat the spiders themselves or the insects or whatever as in the most unscientific way possible. And I'm thinking, too, of Thor, the first Thor movie. I'm looking at you. It's the gymnastics it goes through in order to have, like, the wormholes and, like, the tree of Yggdrasil and, like, all that stuff. It's like, what you consider, what we consider science, you consider magic or whatever, it just really muddled things up and made it more difficult, I think, to, especially in the case of Spider-Man, it made it more difficult to figure out what was science fictional about the situation. And I think a lot of our sort of understandings of spiders, our pop culture understandings of spiders, actually do come from our relationship with comics and these messy sort of pop culture moments like Spider-Man. So I think I just rambled a lot there. I'm going to shut up.
No, I like that. Okay, so let's take that and run with it, actually. So cultural depictions of spiders, whether it's science fiction and fantasy or not, whether it gets categorized as that or not. Let's maybe go back and think about what our cultural perceptions of spiders are. How far can we go back and sort of say, here's a story that stars a spider? Like, what would that be? What would one of the first stories be that you know of?
Oh, man. I'm trying to think. And I mean, definitely the first one I ever encountered was Lord of the Rings. But I don't know... No,
I'm thinking, like, way the fuck back, like,
are you thinking, like, mythology? Okay,
yeah, like, mythology. Where do we find spiders? Way, way back.
Yeah. Okay, so... Obviously, there's the mythological figure where the word arachnid comes from. Was her name Arachne? I want to say Arachne.
Yeah, I think that's how I pronounce it.
And she had an interesting backstory, if I'm remembering my very basic, like, Greek mythology 101 right. And you did remind me of a couple key points in the show notes, which is to say that Arachne was a female, she was like a regular human being, very beautiful, and she was transformed into a spider after competing or being, something about her beauty or skill was repulsive.
I think the weaving competition.
The weaving competition, and she lost, but she was transformed as kind of like a consolation prize. Like, we'll let you live, but you'll live on as a spider. And, I mean, I don't think I remember any negative connotations with her. Of course, the Greeks were not living in Australia, so maybe...
Right.
Maybe there are spiders in Greece for more weavers than biters. I'm going to throw that out there. And there's also Anansi. And most people are going to be familiar with Anansi from the Neil Gaiman book Anansi Boys, from Anansi's appearances in American Gods book and television show. And I think they might be adapting Anansi Boys as well. So there's a couple different manifestations of these mythological characters which have endured, but I think it's interesting to see how they're also informed by our modern perceptions of spiders.
Yes.
Like, I don't know of any Arachne in modern pop culture, but Anansi at least is definitely informed by our current fears of spiders. All you have to do is look at how he manifests in that one episode of American Gods. And you'll be like, yes, he's not only playing off of the cultural, legacy of Anansi in, I think it's Native American culture, I want to say, or African.
Yeah, African.
One of the African nations gets depicted. And yet, it's also simplified. It's also distilled down to something sort of that Neil Gaiman can throw into a book and not ask you to kind of delve into complicated backstory and details and cultural history. I mean, I think that he tips his hat at it, but I don't think he's asking his readers to kind of investigate which African nation or area of origin did Anansi come from. I don't think that's what the books are doing. Anyway, so
Yeah.
that's
So we have
again.
clearly we have like a long cultural history of spiders.
Yeah.
With folks. Before we get into what some of that legacy might be, I really want to think about how spiders are used in science fiction and fantasy. Like when they come up, where do we tend to see them? And now I'm thinking like, very recent past, like last 100 years. We brought up the old like golden age sci-fi trope of the bug-eyed monster, the Bem.
Sure.
And it seems like insects, bugs, arthropods in general are kind of a go-to for making an alien, or at least they were, I think they still are, for a while. But spiders, especially if you encounter them in science fiction or fantasy, they're the bad guys, right? And why is that? Like, what fear are those works really trying to play with?
Well, okay, some of it is the gross factor. I think it's unfortunate but true that we have associated spiders with gross, icky insects. And most insects are not gross and icky, period. But we have kind of roped and thrown spiders in with a bunch of others that we would not want touching us because they're gross and icky or whatever. There's also the possible danger component. So some spiders are venomous. Some are something else like brown recluses. We don't know how their venom, and I'm using air quotes here, works. Some people react and most people don't. I'm one of the people who does not react to brown recluse venom. And I've learned this from experience.
How do you know that?
Because I spent 2 years in college living in a house where... Okay, so brown recluses do not nest in houses. They nest in the grounds around a house. And it turns out that my college campus had these steam pipes in tunnels under the campus. And those tunnels were all infested. And so every now and then, when they get disturbed, you have like a wave of brown recluses come out. And we happened to live near one of the sort of maintenance duct exits. And so they would just, they'd be in our house a lot. So I remember one year, I think I'd counted 37 brown recluses, several of them on my body. Before I finally, I caught one and put it in a plasticware container and mailed it through campus mail to my RA. And I sent him an email with pictures, like the worst possible pictures, which are probably photoshopped on Google. I sent him an email full of them, and it was like, fix this.
Yes.
And so the only solution, it turns out, is to put out more sticky traps, and that's not a guarantee. So... Nope. I learned a lot about spiders. Like, by the way, you can't really effectively spray for spiders because they don't make much contact with the ground that you spray. So they're never going to pick up enough of the pesticide or whatever to actually kill them. Anyway, fun fact, I do not react to brown recluse venom, and I'm very, very thankful for that.
Yeah, that's great.
But a lot of people do. And so you don't want to test out, like, whether you react or not. Like,
no.
Don't do that, people. I also, I grew up in Australia, and I was lucky enough to emerge 7.5 years later without ever having been bitten by a redback or a funnel web or even just a regular old trapdoor tarantula. I was very, very lucky in my years there, but there is like a danger component to spiders, and I think the gross ick factor combined with the danger factor combined with the surprise effect of spiders, because they're not like snakes, which you can generally see coming and which hiss and rattle. They're just like these silent little things that occasionally you turn around and it's right there, like hanging from the roof in front of your face.
Yes.
So like there's that, and I think that makes them great fodder for body horror literature and film, and for horror.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of maybe not arachnophobia. I will not ever see arachnophobia for very obvious reasons. But I'm thinking of those. There's a movie in which I think it's like an alien slug or something eats people's tongues, and controls them and turns them into zombies.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Is it they? I don't think it is. I don't remember. I don't
watch enough horror movies. But I think spider horror films belong in a similar category, but not identical. Because there's the thing that you can't see, which could get you at any time kind of horror, which is like Alien movies. And then there's the, you know it's coming, and it's right there, and it's gross, and that's like the Predator films.
Right.
Or sort of. And so I could ramble on about this for a while, but I think spider films have connections to some of these other insect or zombie or body horror related to infection films, but they are also a class of their own.
Yeah.
That's where I'm going to fall.
I agree with that, because if we think about, say, Starship Troopers as as a movie that's like pulling on a lot of different insects as bad guys, like the way that insects are presented in that movie clearly is not analogous with like giant spiders from other movies. And if we like it would and I just have this sense that especially on screen, when you see a spider or something that's coded as a spider, it's different from the sorts of visceral, like, affective reactions you're meant to have than when you see something that is an insect or coded as an insect. Even, like, I'm thinking down to the bug-eyed monsters. And, like, bug eyes, and I'm thinking here of fly eyes specifically, sort of like, you know, the dome of eye with all of the different small components to it, is very different from the spider with, you know, the maybe a couple of compound or complex eyes and a bunch of like little simple eyes, so you don't quite know where to look, and then you have the mouth parts and the pedipalps, and like spiders are just so grotesque in a different way once you like look at them. So I totally am 100% with you on like the body horror and the coming out of nowhere, but just like the sheer alienness of spiders, even in a way that insects don't have. Because if you try and think about it logically, like say, you know, you're comparing an encounter with a bee to an encounter with a spider, like if you piss off the bee, it's probably going to sting you and that's going to hurt. So it's kind of, it's illogical that like, you know, I don't want to fuck with that spider because it might bite me, because that's like never gonna happen unless you're like really pissing the spider off. But it happens much more with the bee. But just like the package of the spider, the fact that it might come out of nowhere and be on your body, and there's that horror, the idea that it can like, you know, produce these webs in a way that seems completely unnatural, the fact that they like, the way that they kill their prey is by, you know, weaving them up in these like terrible little cocoons and piercing them and turning their innards to juice and sucking the juice out. It's just like, it's so horrific in the same way that like in Alien, the caterpillar being eaten from the inside out by those wasp larvae, the actual creatures upon which the alien xenomorph life cycle is based. Like, it's that level of horror, but that's all spiders. Like, that's every spider. And obviously there are different hunting methods depending upon species and genus and whatnot. But in terms of, like, the horror of spiders, I think that there's a lot. Like, you have a fairly long list, and that a lot of movies, a lot of books, a lot of pieces of science fiction and fantasy that have spiders are drawing upon that list. It makes it much harder then to come out the other side and do something good with spiders.
Which brings us to Adrian Tchaikovsky and Children of Time.
Yes.
Yes. So, for those of you who haven't read this book, get thee to a bookstore. It's incredible. I'm saying this as an arachnophobe who was deeply uncomfortable for about the first 50 pages. It was recommended to me by someone I trust, Tony. So I did stick it out because I like to stick out the books that are recommended to me by you specifically. Most people I give 50 pages, and if I'm not sold, I will put the book away. But I do have to admit that Children of Time really steps up its game, probably about a third of the way through. And so this book starts with spiders on an alien planet. It's kind of a case of I don't know, Earth spermia, whatever. We took these spiders to the planet accidentally, then we sprayed some super goo on them, and they, became super spiders. I mean, it's kind of like the inverse case of Spider-Man, which I think is hilarious and great.
It is.
And the spider in question that rises to prominence is Portia labacia, or labiata, I think maybe. And this is a jumping spider. And when you look at these spiders in real life, they're tiny, they're cute. Actually, they're one of those like furry spiders that looks ridiculous. It doesn't look threatening. It looks ridiculous. Yes. But then the book is asking us to imagine these spiders scaled way up, to imagine them in social groups and interacting with other spider and insect species, which have their own social groups and have also been affected by the spider goo from Earth, and then to develop not just one spider, but a whole species of spiders as protagonists, as main characters. You're inside the mind of these spiders as they are evolving rapidly over the course of generations. And then you're contrasting them against, frankly, kind of terrible human characters. And I say terrible because they're meant to be terrible. They are the perfect definition of the unlikable character. So you have unlikable humans, and then you have weirdly repellent, attractive, likable spiders.
Right, who you're expected to empathize with. Like, you're rooting for the spiders. Like, you're very much invested in their social development, in how their society is going, in the individual Portias and other characters who you meet. Like, you are asked to, in a way that no other work I can think of does, empathize with this I don't want to say creature because it's not just one, but like this class of organisms that has been for so long treated as this trope of repellent alien garbage, essentially.
Yeah, and so it I did stick with the book primarily because I was told to, but I also found as I went along that I was won over by the sheer audacity of Tchaikovsky's determination to create something new, to create a new space in the spider canon, so to speak, and to do so by using, frankly, kind of outlandish new plot constructs. Like, I haven't seen a multi-generational saga about human or other species characters that makes them interchangeable and yet distinct the way that Tchaikovsky uses the Portias. So you have one Portia, she does her cool thing for her generation of spiders, and then another Portia in a future generation does another really important thing for her generation of spiders. And in so doing, you see vast epic timescales that in human books you're looking at like Dune scope, only compressed down like the entire Dune canon into one book, or you're looking at something like what are some other multi-generational sagas? I mean, because that's what it is.
It is, and I mean, I can think of like, nope.
See, it's really hard. That is a new thing that I'd never seen done. And then you also you have three main plot lines. You have the spider plot line, you have this human who's come to create the planet's new biosphere, and she's orbiting around, and she's kind of merging with AI, and that's another plot point. And then you have a third POV character who's a guy who's on one of the last generation ships traveling from a dying Earth to this new Earth that they want to colonize, and of course then they arrive and it's not quite what they expected. And so you have these three plot lines, and one of them, it starts with characters that you expect to hate and then you find out you really like, and then the other two plot lines are these characters that you thought you'd like and then you find out that you hate. And so two-thirds emotionally of the book, at least, is taken up with these characters who just completely ruin like any preconceived notion of what you're getting into. And
Right.
I love it so much, but it's really daring. It's really, really daring to give 2/3 of your emotional weight to people and characters that you're not supposed to like, and another third to a group of characters that you're unlikely to like easily, if that makes sense.
Right.
So,
and I think it's important to note as well that the book doesn't exceed solely on its gotcha potential. Like, it's not about the reversal of, oh, I find myself empathizing with the spiders when I thought I was supposed to, be on the side of the humans who are all awful. It's not that, but because we're talking specifically about the spiders here, I think it's useful to focus on that as an example of what spiders can do in a work of science fiction or fantasy that isn't just be the bog standard bad guy.
Yeah. I mean, Tchaikovsky can write. I mean, the dude has skill at the sentence level and the chapter level and so on and so forth. And I could compare him to several books that I've read this week, in both flattering ways for these other books and also negative ways for some of the other books, because he's a very skilled writer. Now, I think that in general, there's a danger when you put giant spiders in space, and that's going to be the thing that people remember about your book. And I haven't really spent much time on Twitter chatting with Adrian Tchaikovsky about whether he's celebrates or is frustrated by the fact that everyone calls his book like the giant spiders in space book, instead of like this very well written sci-fi book that incidentally may also contain references to spiders. I think that the danger with putting a giant space spider in your book is that everyone's going to look at it and be like, that's what it's about, even when it's not entirely or even majority-wise about that. So if you're listening to this, Adrian Tchaikovsky, and you can totally weigh in.
So, as long as we're on the subject of Children in Times, some of the interesting work that it does is gender and sex politics in spider society. And that leads us into talking about something else, which is spiders and the feminine. Because, as we were putting our show notes together, we were both kind of on the same page that spiders, a lot of the time, get coded as feminine and bad. Or in the same breath that they're coded as, killers or evil or what have you, they're also coded as feminine.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, you're talking to like a flaming radical feminist here, but the tight association between the feminine and the evil is something that recurs not just in spider lore, but in various other lores as well. You could look at another cousin of it, which is the praying mantis. You could look at the Black Widow specifically as iconic of this problem. But there is definitely this tight association between the sexual, the femininely sexual, and the consuming, the uncontrollable, the dangerous. And I think what's great too about Tchaikovsky's Children of Time is that every main character, every Portia main character is feminine, and encapsulates a lot of feminine values which we don't traditionally associate with, or at least maybe not traditionally, but we don't currently associate with spider lore. Because most current spider lore, it's a giant threatening spider of whatever gender, Shelob, etc., Aragog. And so he confounds that in a pleasurable way, but he also provides the unlikable human characters to comment on, perceived gender stereotypes and gender constructs. So it's really, I would say it does a very good job of portraying spiders as weavers, maybe taking us back to a little bit of that sort of association.
Right, and I think that that's an important thing to note as well. Like, if we're going back to the story of Arachne in the Greek, and tracing sort of the feminine spider was produced in this way, and spiders eat their mates, and bad egg sacs, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that's a Western tradition. Like, spiders as feminine and rapacious and all of that is a very Western thing. If we look at, and I think Anansi is a great example, if we look at some African folklores or some stories of the native peoples of the Americas, like, spiders are genderless or spiders are male, but they're also presented in a very different way. Not that sort of, like, ravenous, hungry, killer kind of way.
Yeah, and the jumping out of dark corners.
If we flip... Yeah. Right, exactly. And if we flip that on its head and return to Charlotte's Web, and like other children's presentations, I'm thinking of the Disney Pixar movie A Bug's Life here, which also featured a spider who was a female spider. But like Charlotte, she was presented as nurturing and feminine and, you know, obviously not that typical idea of a spider, but also a very typically feminine production of what that should be, of what the feminine should be in, like, modern Western culture.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, like, you know, and that goes back, I think, just as much to what Adrian Tchaikovsky did in Children of Time to sort of, this is going to sound like a weird statement, but liberate the spider. And, like, really getting away from that cultural conception of spiders can only be one thing or the other. They either have to be these deadly killers or these, like, they were actually women all along, like, you know, in the makeover movies where you just take her glasses off and do her hair up and she's suddenly pretty. Like, spiders, if you just put a little makeup on them and give them some time to spin something a bit of the pig pen, like, they were just ladies all along. So, I think getting away from that is an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting interpretation for sure. I mean, you have to wonder, do we in part embrace stereotypes? Oh my god. Do we embrace stereotypes? Specifically in order to take pleasure in confounding them every now and then? Because Charlotte's Web is in part pleasurable because it departs from stereotypical depictions of spiders for kids. Kids are very used to being taught not to touch spiders, to run from spiders, to be afraid of spiders. And then here's Charlotte's Web with the sweet, nurturing mama figure. And so I think perhaps part of the pleasure of Charlotte's Web, perhaps part of the pleasure of Children of Time and other positive portrayals of spiders is that they confound the stereotype. And sometimes we really like that. In fact, isn't that like half of the plot of Batman? So, I would say it would be interesting to look at the history of spider depictions. And someone else maybe has the time to plot this out for every spider depiction in history. But look at, okay, first of all, were we taking pleasure? Did we create this art to celebrate the spider on its own? Or were we creating this art in order to take pleasure in the confounding of expectations? And... you know, so on and so forth. And, or the pleasure of embracing expectations, because I think that's part of the appeal of arachnophobia, is we're like, yes, this does exactly what I thought it would. It terrifies me. Yeah. You know? So there's pleasure in both sort of responses to a scary stereotype.
Yeah. You know, I agree with that. And I think that that's a useful thing to sort of visit here at the end of the podcast, because I think it's easy to kind of poo-poo the spider as like, oh, well, they're just always used as this negative thing, you know, this easy go-to alien when you want something that's grotesque and terrible, and when people do something opposite that, like, it's great. But I do think you're right, and it's important to recognize the pleasure that can be had in recognizing and, like, shivering at the terror that is the alien spider on screen or in a book. And like, there's a reason why we keep coming back to that. And it is that that image is accessible and it's triggering something in us, and it's fun to do that. Not to put your hand into a terrarium full of spiders, but to, you know, watch people on screen or like read about characters in a book encountering that. Like, it is, and I don't, my goal in this podcast is not to say to everyone who has ever enjoyed spiders that they, or has ever been afraid of spiders, or who has ever written about spiders as bad guys, not to do that. But
oh no. In fact, like, I think a good point to make at this juncture would be when we look at books as diverse as Children of Time and Spacemen of Bohemia and Charlotte's Web and The Lord of the Rings, you know, sometimes the spider's being used as an easy reach. Like, the author needed a tool, and this was the tool that was available or jumped to mind. Haha, no pun intended. And so he used it, or she used it, although, in fact, I think all of the authors we've mentioned, except for perhaps, is E.B. White male or female?
No,
I don't remember.
No, male.
Okay, male. So every author so far we've talked about that's used spiders has been male. Funny fact there. But they reached for the spider stereotype. It did its job. It was the right tool for the moment. There are times when using the easy reach is too easy, when you're relying too much on trope or stereotype to create a work which is pithy and imaginative and creative. These authors we talked about haven't made that mistake. They've used the right tool for the moment. But there are plenty of B-grade horror movies out there that have. There are plenty of pulp sci-fi novels. Not that I dislike pulp sci-fi novels, but there are plenty of pulp sci-fi novels that have also made the easy reach, and they've failed to give us anything new. So I think if you're going to bring in the giant space spider or the giant talking spider or whatever, you need to do it in partnership with other excellent world-building skills. And you need to do it with creativity and ingenuity in what the spider means. And perhaps part of the reason why we're struggling to kind of find a through line for this podcast, and we love Messy Podcast, is that
yes, we do.
These authors are each doing something so radically different that there isn't that much shared DNA. And that's kind of cool, too.
Yeah.
And that's my rant.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to wrap it up. Like, spiders are, you know, if there's one conclusion we can come to through this podcast, I think it's that we started with a list of works in our show notes, and we've talked through most of them now. And my sense of it was that there was kind of a through line. Like, there was this idea that, like, either spiders are awful or spiders are not awful and have been redeemed from that stereotype. But, you know, talking about these, I see that we have tons of different depictions of spiders, that spiders are much more diverse in their depictions in science fiction and fantasy than I knew. But that's no reason to be complacent about it. And I'm sure we, you know, if our end note is anything, it is queer up the spiders, yo. So.
Yeah, and if you are a woman or a person of color and you write, and you hear this podcast, and you're hearing the same thing we are, which is, it's weird that it's only mostly white men writing spider tropes, then maybe that's what you need to do with your next book, is bring us a giant queer space spider, or not space spider, you know, go for it. We'd love to see something else that's new brought to this canon, because every other thing we've talked about has been great, so...
Yep. So, Will, I think that's an excellent place to leave it for today.
Yeah.
Maybe do you want to talk about where you can find us on the web?
Sure.
The web, pun intended.
Boom. Never say that again.
Nope.
You can find us easier online than you can in person, because we are both out and about quite a lot. You can follow our adventures on Twitter. We each have our own individual handles. Tony's is deviance_engine. Mine is intrepid_Lee. And then together we run the Imaginaries Twitter, which is imaginary_pod. And we've been having some great interactions with our fans and followers and listeners on Twitter lately. So shout out to all of you guys. It's so much fun to hear you guys throwing out your recommendations and all of that. Yeah, keep it coming. Also, you can find our still under construction website, because I have been doing the summer reading program for the library, and now I'm traveling. You can find our under construction website at Imaginaries.net. And that is a change from our prior website, so please don't go and look at our old website. Look at our new one. We're going to be putting up some blog posts in the future, and we're also going to be writing some nice little feature pieces on the authors that we love and admire, and you know, that we talk about a fair bit on this podcast. So you can follow us there. Anything else that I've forgotten? YouTube, SoundCloud.
And iTunes.
Yeah.
That's where you're going to find us.
We're all over. And if you Google our name and your preferred platform to listen on, you will find us, most likely. And if you have any trouble, do go to that Twitter page, and we will do our best to answer your questions and deliver on your requests. So that's where you can find us, Tony.
That is where you can find us. So I'm gonna say we'll catch you next time. Until then, you know, make sure to snuggle your spiders close. Remember that they might be us.
No.
No.
No, that's a horror movie in and of itself. And you know me in horror movies.
I do. Just, you know, some love for the spiders, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go watch, like, Atomic Blonde or something now so I could get that image out of my head. But yes, thank you so much for listening, guys, and bye!
All right, good night.